Hey everyone, welcome back to RetroBreak and welcome to my video on the launch of the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System. In this video I'm going to be covering everything up to and including the launch of both systems. So let's begin in 1983 and the reveal of the original Nintendo Family Computer. So although the Famicom is Nintendo's first proper game console with interchangeable cartridges, it wasn't their first TV game system. That was actually the TV Game 6 here, which was released in 1977. So that's how this system looked, and it was nothing more than a basic Pong clone. But over the next 3 years they actually released a variety of different all-in-one systems like that, the last one of which came out in 1980, which was just called the Computer TV Game. And the year after that, in 1981, after no longer working on the TV colour game consoles, they set out to build the Famicom, which was their first proper interchangeable cartridge designed system. And Nintendo's president at the time was adamant that this console should cost less than 10,000 yen, and the developers really struggled over the next 2 years to cut the costs down as much as possible. In the end, they couldn't quite manage it, and it retailed for 14,000 yen, which wasn't far off, and actually Nintendo's president at the time, Mr. Yamauchi, was actually very happy with the end result, and he said they managed to get it as low as physically possible. And if you're curious, that 14,000 yen equated to around 100 US dollars, or about £78 at the time, and taking inflation into account, that equates to around 20,000 Japanese yen today, which is around 140 American dollars, or around £108 here in the UK. So that kind of puts it into perspective. It was actually still a very cheap system, even if you compare it to today's standards. So once the system was finalised and the price was finalised, they went out to about 80 wholesalers to try and find people to market and sell this product in Japan. And because they hadn't worked with any third parties before, this was an entirely Nintendo-based system, and it only included 3 launch games. They were Donkey Kong, Popeye, and Donkey Kong Jr., all 3 of which being arcade ports, and that was really the selling point of the system. At the time, it was to play the arcade games at home, and they did a great job with the ports as well. They're not quite arcade perfect, but they're close enough that the majority of people at the time probably wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. And as far as Nintendo was concerned, there was no third-party support planned whatsoever. And because this was their first major home console, there wasn't really any big events or trade shows where they actually showed this off for the first time either. The Japanese gaming landscape at the time was very different to how it is today as well. There wasn't really any popular home consoles around the same time in 1983. There were a few. There was the Epoch Cassette Vision, which was released in 1981, which is another interchangeable cartridge device. There was the Magnavox Odyssey 2, which is a very similar machine as well. The Intellivision, which was a little bit more powerful than those and had a few more interesting games. But most importantly, in Japan was their PC scene. They actually had a series of computers released by NEC called the NEC PC-88 series, and they were very popular in Japan at the time. They came out in 1981, so a few years before the Famicom, and actually they came out the year that Nintendo started developing for the Famicom. And of course, Nintendo had their previous 5 consoles still on sale at the time as well, so there wasn't really that much competition in the home video game market. And what's really wild about this release, the release date, by the way, was the 15th of July 1983, and on that exact same day, Sega also released their first home video game console, the SG-1000, so it's wild that both of them released on exactly the same day, and neither of them had had proper home consoles before that either. So really, the console wars began immediately on launch day. Of course, Nintendo dominated in Japan, and Sega, with the SG-3000 and also the Mark II and III afterwards, could never really properly catch up, but we will be getting back to Sega when we move on to the worldwide launch a bit later on in this video. So Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983, and it was off to a slow start, and it wouldn't be until another 2 years' time that the console came out outside of Japan. But what happened in those 2 years in between, and did they impact the release overseas? Well, let's take a look at what happened. So they finally got third-party support for the system in 1984 with some very, very strict requirements for third parties to get their games onto Nintendo's consoles. They really wanted to maintain the quality and, I guess, not take away sales from their first-party releases too. Hudson was actually the very first third-party manufacturer, and the first game that they released for the system I've actually got right here, and it was Lode Runner. And all of the original games for the Famicom had these really plain logos as well. They just had like little waves on the front and just the name of the game in black writing. But Famicom cartridges are a whole nother story that I would love to cover in a future video. I'm definitely going to get back to that, but let's move on from Hudson and the rest of the third-party developers. Namco was also there. They released Galaxian and Pac-Man, so even more amazing arcade conversions for the system. And by the end of 1984, there was actually 30 different games released for the system, which is far better than 1983's 4 games, because they also got the original Mario Brothers at the end of that year. And also in 1983 as well, Atari released their first game console in Japan, away from their home country of America. That was the Atari 2800, and it was a complete failure in Japan, but overseas Atari was also failing spectacularly in America, and Nintendo saw this. They saw the video game crash of '83, as it's very well known these days, and they did not want a repeat of that. So let's take a look now at what Nintendo attempted to do to combat the video game crash in America. So Nintendo knew that third-party support for the Atari was a big player in the downfall of the system and the industry as a whole. There was far too many games being released and the quality was just not there. The story's a legend at this point. Games were being buried in landfill and it was just a disaster for the industry. So Nintendo wanted to take a completely different approach to marketing the console over in America. First of all, they completely redesigned the system because they did not think that this design, with its attached controllers on very, very short cords and the general kid-friendliness of the design, would not appeal to the American audience. So at CES in 1985, Nintendo debuted the Advanced Video System, a completely reimagined version of the Famicom for the American audience. It's very different to what ended up coming out over in America, but these prototype systems do look really, really interesting. But there was one thing that they failed to realize. They really overcomplicated this original release. They weren't just showing off the console, they were showing off attachable keyboards, a music keyboard as well as a writing keyboard. There was a disk drive, there was wireless controllers, there was a light gun. There was just far too much going on, and American consumers at the time just didn't really understand what they were looking at, and a lot of these features got scrapped for the final release. And also, the Advanced Video System was very close to what Atari was calling some of their consoles, and there was kind of a bad connotation around the words video systems. So Nintendo decided to come back a few months later to the summer version of CES, which was hosted in June, with the brand new name, the Video Entertainment System, which is very close to the final name for the system, and they didn't show the keyboard off this time either. Instead, they decided to show off Rob, the robotic operating buddy, a complete robot to go alongside the video game console, because they thought if they marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy instead of a game console, they could get into different distributors and maybe they could distance themselves from some of that stigma around the video game market. So in November 1985, Nintendo showed off yet another redesigned version of the console, which is the one we ended up with, the Nintendo Entertainment System here, and they were really proud of this front-loading feature that kind of made it similar to a VCR, which they thought would fit in a lot nicer with the American homes back in the day, and I really do like this design. And they also announced an official launch date, which strangely was only for New York, and they wanted to test the waters very carefully before spreading out to the rest of America in the months to follow. And before the official launch, which was 18th of November 1985 in New York, they actually threw a pre-release launch party on October 9th in New York as well, to show off the system and some of the games and to give away a bunch of merchandise before the launch of the system, which I think would have been really exciting for people at the time to go and experience this. And as well as Rob the Robot, it actually launched as a bundle that came with the robot, and it also came with the Zapper here as well, which came with a game called Duck Hunt, where you could point at the screen like this and shoot the ducks. So Nintendo was really going for a range of different gameplay ideas. Of course, it came with the standard controller with a much longer cable than the ones that came out in Japan as well. So you had traditional games, you had light gun games, and you had robotic operated games as well. And I'm sure kids in America at the time were so excited about all of these new unique ways to play video games. And also, unlike the Japanese launch, this actually launched with around 16 or 17 games. And I say "or" because for some reason there is no concrete proof that Super Mario Bros. Was a launch title for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I've scoured the internet and there is not a single concrete release date for Super Mario, but the rest of the 16 launch titles were definitely there day one. And you can take a look at them over the screen right now. I think it's a great set of launch games. Obviously, they're very basic compared to what came out later in the system's life, but there's a great range of different genres, and there really is a game for everyone in this lineup. It really is amazing. So the soft launch for the Nintendo Entertainment System was in November 1985 in New York, and it would take a few more months until February 1986 when they expanded outside of New York, and their next destination was Los Angeles. And as well as that, Mattel actually picked up the license to distribute the Nintendo Entertainment System in Canada, and they also started doing that in February 1986 as well. And surprisingly, for most of the rest of that year, they were the only three places that you could actually buy the system outside of Japan. It wasn't until September that year that the rest of the United States actually got their hands on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And by September, it was out all across America and all across Japan. So now let's take a look at the rest of the world, and there's some really, really interesting stories here. Let's start with Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has always been a fascinating place for video games, and the launch of the NES is absolutely crazy. Not only did they start importing Famicoms as soon as the system launched in Japan, so way back in 1983, you could have gone into a computer store in Hong Kong and been able to pick yourself up a family computer complete in box just like this, but also in 1986, they started importing the Nintendo Entertainment System as well. So already by the start of 1986 you had access to both Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System, and I assume a bunch of imported games for both consoles as well. What's even stranger about Hong Kong is the fact that they actually got official releases of both the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System by Nintendo. And they came in their own completely original blue boxes that said Hong Kong version for use in Hong Kong only. So I have no idea why they released both consoles. Surely that would just confuse people because it's mostly the same games on both. So not only did they get the NES and the Famicom, but even crazier is the fact that their Famicom release in Hong Kong, which was released by a company called Simon & Toys, is really interesting because it actually has a switch on the back that allows you to switch between 50 and 60 hertz, because Hong Kong has like dual TV displays, and that's a conversation for another video, but it's so fascinating. But it was an NTSC console, but it had PAL output, and you could either switch between PAL 50 or PAL 60 because Hong Kong used the PAL TV format at the time. Hong Kong is a fascinating history of Nintendo all on its own, and actually AkFamilyHome did a great video on the history of Nintendo in Hong Kong, and I used some of that video for the research for this one, so definitely check that out after. And now let's move on to our next region worldwide, which is actually Venezuela. Yes, we're going there, Venezuela. So first of all, piracy is rampant in Venezuela and much of South America as well, but Venezuela in particular is interesting because they had a lot of money at the time, and they had a semi-official distributor from Nintendo called Nintendo CA, which was kind of half official and half unofficial, but they did actually release their own versions of the NES and the Famicom, so again, just like Hong Kong, they had both different versions of the system. But Nintendo CA would also release their own weird unlicensed versions of ROM hacks at the time, which was really strange. So there was a game called Mario 16, which was just a ROM hack of a different game, and it put Mario's sprite on there. And there's a bunch of these other games released at the time in Venezuela by Nintendo CA, and the whole thing just makes absolutely no sense to me. It's just a really muddy mess of legalities, and I don't really understand anything that was going on in there, but I just thought it was really interesting that it was kind of a semi-official release of the console too. Right, where shall we go next? I'm loving making this video, by the way. So next, let's go to South Korea. Let's see what South Korea did with the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom. Actually, Nintendo wasn't allowed to do anything. It was Hyundai that released the Famicom in Korea, and they called it the Comboy. So, at the time, due to the political climate, Korea didn't want to import any Japanese hardware into the country, so Nintendo got around this loophole by partnering up with Hyundai, who released the Nintendo Entertainment System under their own name, so they called it the Hyundai Comboy. But interestingly, it still has Nintendo's name on the console, and it says Nintendo Entertainment System Korea version. And it's actually modelled after the North American version of the Nintendo Entertainment System, not the Japanese one, and even more interestingly, it only plays games from Korea, so only games that Hyundai actually published in that region. It has a completely different lockout chip to the American console. I can't really find much more information out about it online. There wasn't many games released for it, and apparently it didn't sell very well either, because most of the Famicoms and NESs that came out in Korea were the same kind of black market, counterfeit consoles that were kind of clones of Famicom hardware, so no one wanted to buy the more expensive official versions. Although, by doing a bit of research online, I did find out that Nintendo partnered with Hyundai again for the launch of the Super Nintendo a few years later, and that one did a little bit better. But how about the rest of Asia? Well, Nintendo didn't stop at just Korea, Venezuela, and North America. They also went to the rest of Asia and made a specific Asia version of the console. So I think they did this because of the 50-60Hz and PAL NTSC conversion issues around different parts of Asia, depending on where they got their TV technology from first. So what's really interesting about these Asia-specific versions of the consoles is that they're completely region-free. They can play PAL and NTSC games. There isn't much more to say about these, and they also didn't sell very well because of the piracy across Asia at the time and all of the different clone systems, which had already been out for years before Nintendo finally got around to releasing their official versions of the console. But again, it's a very interesting curiosity. Let's not forget about our friends over in Brazil though, and Brazil has always been known as the country of Sega, and yeah, Sega basically had a complete foothold in the Brazilian market, and it wasn't actually until 1995 that Nintendo first stepped foot in Brazil with the Nintendo Entertainment System, but because of tariffs and other license agreements making it very difficult for official consoles to be released in Brazil for any reasonable amount of money, they actually partnered with a company called Gradiente under their Playtronic label, and they finally released the Nintendo in 1995, but I'm sure it was far too late by that point and it didn't do very well at all, but it's just another one of those interesting releases. And they're just the official releases. I have a big list here of all of the different bootleg Famicom and NES consoles that came out, some of which came out far before Nintendo ever officially released their systems too. There was the Dynavision 2 by Dynacom, there was the Bit System by Dismac, the High Top Game by Milmar, the Top Game aka VG9000 by CCE, the Phantom System also by Gradotine, there was the Supercharger by IBTC, Dynavision 3, the Handyvision, and the Genicom as well, which doesn't actually have an official release year. So they were just some of the many bootlegs that were floating around in Asia that were competing for a piece of Nintendo's pie in those markets. So that was Asia, North America, a bit of South America, and Japan, but what about Europe? Europe's even more of a mess. Are you ready for this? So the first difficult thing for Nintendo in Europe was the fact that they had no European headquarters. They had no way of distributing the console themselves in those markets. Unlike North America, unlike Japan, Europe is very divided up into completely different countries with completely different languages and completely different businesses too. There was also different business legislations in the different regions, as well as different TV specifications too, so there was so many things to take into consideration, and this was just a minefield for Nintendo. And also, in Europe, the video game landscape was very different to the rest of the world as well, because by that point in around 1986, Europe was already solidified as a video gaming area, and they had loads of different home consoles, microcomputers, and arcades all competing for the video game market. So the Atari 2600 had already been around for almost a decade at that point, having released in 1978, and built up quite a big nice market share over there in Europe. The Intellivision came out in 1982 and also did quite well over there as well. The ColecoVision also came out in 1982, and Nintendo actually supported the ColecoVision with some official games for that system as well, and also the Atari 2600 too. The Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC were all taking over the UK at the time as well, with the boom of the microcomputers, and unlike America, there was no video game crash in Europe, so video games were still going strong, and Nintendo had a lot more to compete with over there. So let's begin with Scandinavia, because for Nintendo, Scandinavia was actually the easiest part of Europe for them to get into, because they already had a distributor there called Bergsala, who had been distributing the Game & Watch systems since 1981. So thanks to them, the Nintendo Entertainment System actually began selling in Sweden in September of 1986, which was only a year after the American launch. And thanks to Bergsala's outreach, Norway and Finland were the second two countries to get involved in the Nintendo Entertainment System in early 1987. And this new Nintendo distribution did so well for Bergsala, who were also a toy distributor and games distributor, they stopped everything to focus 100% on Nintendo. And I love this photo from their offices at the time. So when they were distributing the NES back in 1986, they had this giant statue of Mario outside of their offices. That original statue of Mario actually stayed there for 20 years, and unfortunately it got replaced after that with a much more modern interpretation of Mario, who's now coming out of a pipe instead of just standing on this weird column in the middle of nowhere. But the really cool thing about the Bergsala offices that are now rebranded to just Nintendo, they actually also have a museum on campus which is still open to this day, and there's some photos from inside here, and it looks like they've got some really interesting promotional statues from a variety of different periods in Nintendo's history, and they all look a little bit creepy, I'm not gonna lie. So the second area in Europe to start selling the NES was actually Germany. Just like Scandinavia, they already had a distributor for the Game & Watch, and that was a German company, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, so feel free to correct me in the comments down below. It was called Bienengraber, I think. Anyway, this Bienengraber company had been around since the early 1980s, and they sold the Game & Watch under a brand called Trickotronic, I think. And again, they also managed to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System in September of 1986, but only in one retailer. That was somewhere called Media Market, which looks to be something kind of like Target as an American equivalent, so just a big general department store that was big in Germany at the time. So that's how you could go and buy your Nintendo Entertainment System in Germany in September of 1986. Unfortunately, that company went bankrupt just a few years later in 1990, and Nintendo actually decided to set up their European headquarters in Germany and took over the distribution from that original company also in 1990, so they carried on the distribution in Germany and eventually around the rest of Europe. But before that, there is still a lot more confusion to come, so let's move on to the mess that is France. And goodness me, France sounds like it went through some problems to get the Nintendo Entertainment System onto the shelves. So they didn't have any distributors for Nintendo stuff before then, or at least not any that reached out and managed to get licenses for the Entertainment System. So in 1987, at another CES show, a company called ASD, which stands for Audio Sound Distribution, went there with the hopes of getting the distribution rights to either the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Sega Master System, and they somehow managed to get Nintendo's grace to greenlight their distribution for Nintendo in France, and they were hoping to begin selling the system in September of 1987, but they encountered many issues along the way. So unfortunately, they were hoping to sell something like 100,000 units, but not only did they get delivered late, but they only got 10,000 of them. So unfortunately, not only did they only receive 10,000 systems, which is far shorter than the expectations that the manufacturers had set, they actually only got those 10,000 systems to last all the way up until the end of 1987. So the system was off to a very bad start in France, and it just got even worse because there was an economic downturn at the time, and the company couldn't afford to keep paying Nintendo to get the consoles and get the games shipped over to France. So in the end, Bandai ended up buying the Nintendo Entertainment System rights off the company in 1988. And Bandai managed to turn this around and managed to sell a further 60,000 units by the end of 1988. Still not many compared to the rest of the world, but it was a great start, and Bandai is someone who would go on to work very closely with Nintendo in the future. So now let's take a look at the UK, as well as Italy and Australia, interestingly. Here in the UK, Mattel actually picked up the rights to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yes, the same people who make things like Hot Wheels and Barbie. And that was a massive issue because Mattel actually treated the Nintendo just like a toy. So it went on sale here in the UK officially in 1987. But as I said earlier, the UK was already very deep into the microcomputer scene, and most gamers were just interested in that. And the games for those systems were a lot cheaper than what Mattel was selling the Nintendo Entertainment System games for. You could pick up games here in the UK from places like WH Smith's or Boots or Woolworths. You could get games for like £5 or £10 for a lot of these microcomputers, and Mattel was selling NES games for like £30 or £40, which was just unheard of here in the UK. So at first, it didn't do very well at all. Mattel also did something very frustrating, and they actually made our system here in the UK completely incompatible with any games from any other region, including the rest of Europe, which is, as far as I know, the only console that's ever locked us out from the rest of Europe. And another mistake that Mattel made, they only actually sold the Nintendo through the retailer Boots, which a lot of you will probably know as a pharmaceutical chain more than anything, and for as long as I've known Boots, it's just the place where I bought my meal deals at work, so not really the place that you would go to buy a brand new Nintendo console. Although, maybe back in the 80s things were a little bit different, because I did hear they did sell games back then, but even so, it's still a very small distributor, and it wasn't available in any of the bigger retailers in the UK at the time. And because it was Mattel, and they were treating it like toys rather than a video game system, for the games that didn't sell, they actually just took them off store shelves and just put them in storage. So once a game had been on the store shelves for a few months, if it didn't do very well, that's it. It would just disappear into the ether and would never be sold again as far as Mattel was concerned. So unfortunately, that was the life of the Nintendo Entertainment System for the first 2 years on sale in the UK. That was until 1989, when a different company called Sans Serif picked up the rights to the Nintendo Entertainment System from Mattel and finally managed to turn things around for the company. And interestingly, Sans Serif was actually ran by a former Sega executive, so it's really interesting that he jumped ship from Sega to Nintendo and actually turned Nintendo's fortunes around. And the way they did that was very interesting. So at the time, in the late 80s and early 90s, Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles was very popular in the UK, and they actually released a new bundle of the console which included the new Hero Turtles game, and that went on to do incredibly well for Nintendo, even though they were kind of against the idea because they didn't want it being bundled with a third-party game. But even so, it did really well, and it actually righted a lot of the wrongs that Mattel did, and they finally got rid of that weird Mattel branding on the front of the system, and it was just rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System NES Edition. So there's 2 different versions of the NES here in the UK, and even more interestingly, there's actually 2 different versions of the original Super Mario. So the version of Super Mario that I've got here is the version that was released in 1990, which was actually distributed by Bandai, as you can see at the top right there. And this is the version that's compatible with the Sans Serif version of the NES. This version right here, which my parents picked up in, I think, 1992 from Woolworths, and this is the original box from back then. I'm really happy to own this. But back on the topic of Super Mario, there's actually 2 completely different versions of the Super Mario game. So there was this version that was distributed by Bandai, but there was also a previous Mattel version, and they actually play completely differently too. So This version is actually fixed to run at the proper speed and proper frame rate, but the music is too fast, whereas the Mattel version is exactly the same as the North American release of the game, and it's not actually sped up at all for our 50Hz compatible systems and TVs here in the UK. So the Mattel version actually plays 16% slower than this version, so that means slower music, slower gameplay, whereas in this one, the music's too fast. So as far as I'm aware, there is not a version of Super Mario in the UK that plays at the right speed and has the right music. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just think that's a really fascinating thing. And I've actually ordered the Mattel version of Mario, and I'll do a follow-up video where I test out the two side by side so you can see the difference for yourselves. And the same thing applied to Italy and Australia as well, although interestingly, in Australia, I can't actually find a specific release date. In this book here, the NES Anthology, which is where I've got most of this information, by the way, it's an amazing book, but I think they might have got this fact wrong. So they say that it didn't come out in Australia until 1991, which was actually the year before the Super Nintendo came out. But from looking on Reddit and to do a little bit more research to see whether that was correct, I found an advert from Australia that's dated 1989, which is the same time that the system came out in the UK after Nintendo took over distribution from Mattel, even though I was told it was the Mattel version that came out in Australia. And I've also seen other places on the internet that say that the Mattel version did come out in Australia, also in 1987. So if anyone from Australia is watching, can you give me a specific release date for when the system came out in your region? And speaking of regions as well, Australia, Italy, United Kingdom, they all have Region A, whereas the rest of Europe has Region B. And for those earlier systems, they're not compatible with each other. So the Mattel version Region A can't be played in Europe, and the European Region B can't be played on PAL A systems. It's very complicated and probably unnecessary as well, but that's just how it goes. This was a lot of fun to research, and I'm definitely going to make a follow-up to the Super Nintendo very soon. This was way more interesting than I thought it would be, so I really hope you enjoyed this. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of this video, and if you've got any other interesting facts about the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System too. And if you want to see more Nintendo goodness from me, then click the video up here and take a look at some of my memories from when I first got this particular system right here. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned for the Super Nintendo version coming very soon. Goodbye!